Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Love Books. It's lovely to have so many of you here tonight, and thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night. If anyone's standing and would like a seat, there are actually quite a few down here, so please do come and grab them. Thank you to Jacana for hosting this evening with us. Jacana are, of course, the publishers of Available Light. And I'd just like to take this moment to applaud them for always daring to publish the stories that no one else will. Because these stories, like Omar Badsha's stories in Available Light, are really the stories that we need to hear. Not only that, but they've created a really beautiful book here. Let me show you the cover. But inside is really lovely. And it's just 420 Rand. So please do buy it at the end. Congratulations, as always, Jacana. Not only is Available Light beautifully produced, but it's also been beautifully written, and it's an absolute pleasure to read. And I'd like to congratulate Dan on writing a book that seems to me to be both incredibly personal, while never neglecting the wider historical and social issues of the time. Congratulations, Dan, and it's lovely to have you here tonight. Just a little bit about Dan, so you know who he is. He is a professor of history at Yale University, and he's the author of two other books, The Law and the Prophets, Black Consciousness in South Africa, and The Art of Life in South Africa. Chatting to Dan this evening is Dilip Menon. It's really lovely to have Dilip here tonight. He is a professor of history and international relations at Wits University, where he's also the director of the Center for Indian Studies in South Africa. Thank you so much, and over to the in the entire continent. Thank you, Dilip. And over to the two of you.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to all of you. We have the book up there, but we unfortunately don't have Omar Badsha's 5 volumes, isn't it, of photography. And so some of you are already familiar with him as a photographer. Many of you may not be. Omar is one of the most significant figures on the landscape of South Africa. I feel he is a figure who polarizes opinion, a man of multiple talents, but also of a mercurial temper. And this will come up in conversation. I mean, he's immensely loyal to his friends and commands an exasperated loyalty from his friends. He was arguably one of South Africa's most important photographers, along with figures like Goldblatt, Magubane, Ernest Cole, Santomofo King. He was also the founder of the Afrapix Collective, which was a very significant collective under apartheid, which allowed access to spaces of art for those who are not white, to put it bluntly. He's also, as Dan shows in his book, he's also a trade union organizer, and that's the bit of his life that we knew very little about until Dan wrote his, there's an extensively detailed account of his work in Durban, and we'll talk a bit about that. He's also the founder of the continent's most significant online resource for history. I'm sorry, I should be holding this. I mean, I keep forgetting I need to do what Beyonce does. You know, so he's also the founder of the continent's most important online resource for history, South African History Online, which has extensive entries on South African history, South African personalities. Some of it is arguably idiosyncratic. There are longer entries and shorter entries. The entry on F.W. de Klerk is a very short one and says he had an impeccable sense of timing. Right? So we know that about de Klerk. We also know that Omar is the recipient of the Order of Ikhamanga in silver for his contributions towards South African life and letters. And he received it alongside Hashim Amla, also known for his sense of timing, and Sipho Mabuse, also known for his sense of timing. So there's something there. And Omar is still going strong at 80. I had spoken with him, asking him whether he would like to make it down, but I think it's difficult to travel down from Cape Town to here, travel back, do a kind of discussion in Cape Town, then travel to Durban and so on. So I think he's just left it to Dan, and he's in good hands. So he said, I'm feeling 80 right now. That's why he's not here. So what I'll try and do is we talk for 30 to 40 minutes. Hopefully we shan't witter on forever, and you'll get your chance to ask your questions. Dan, in one sense, is an accidental biographer in the sense that In the course of a conversation with Omar said, "Why don't you write my biography?" Now, if somebody had told me that, I would have balked at it. But he said, "Okay." And he proceeded to write one, and a brilliant one at that. The book begins with a scene that's probably out of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, because there's a tempestuous argument between Dan and Omar asks him to get out of the house and never come back again, which is a very auspicious beginning, I think. And there must be, and for people who know Omar well, I mean, the number of times he's asked his friends to F off is legendary, and I don't think there's any of his friends who's never been asked to F off, if you see what I mean. So in that sense, Dan is being kind of writing a book amidst this mercurial temper is something that I wanted to ask you about. See, the other thing is that when you're writing biographies of the dead, you're in a safe space. They don't talk back, they don't curse at you. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Dan, what was it like working with Omar, working with his personality, which is occasionally very abrasive, often very affectionate, but always unremittingly principled and loving and generous as well. So what was it writing this book about Omar, beside Omar, contra Omar in many instances where you kind of are skeptical of many of the things that he says? So,
thank you, and thank you for being here and for those comments, and thank you all for being here. I will admit that I am both coming directly from winter to this wonderful South African late summer, and I'm also just got off a plane like less than 12 hours ago, so I don't consider myself as lucid as otherwise I would expect to be. So
explain why you're sitting to my left.
Oh, I also can't turn my head to my left, so that's why we're over here now. So in other words, we're killing it, but we're going to do our best. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you note that if someone had proposed that you write their biography, you would have balked at it, and that was initially my response as well. This was actually Omar very generously played your role at a book launch in Cape Town for my second book. And afterwards, we had some wine and we got to talking. And next thing you know, Omar said, "Why don't you write my biography?" And I laughed because I thought that is just, who would say that? What a phenomenal thing to say. But then the next day I had more time to think about it. And I realized that it would offer this really incredible opportunity because Omar, aside from all those other characteristics that you note, is also an amazing archivist of his own self, as well as of South Africa. And so having been in his house, I knew what was there, which were boxes upon boxes of documents and, of course, images everywhere. And then also his own graphic art that was kind of dispersed through the house in bubble wrap. And I thought, what if I could just open this up? And so I saw it as an opportunity and an invitation, and I took it. It was, for also the reasons that you've enumerated, not necessarily easy. Because on the one hand, he is alive, thankfully. And that does mean that I had never worked on a project that involved a living person so intimately, and not only a living person, but a living person who, like many living people, is quite invested in his own sense of who he's been and where he's been and how he would like that understood. So navigating that, it was one of the unique pleasures and challenges of the project. The other element, of course, was that Omar is, as you put it, I think, mercurial is a neutral way of putting it, which is that he did, that I've wanted to open with that disagreement because it struck me that disagreement, which, if I could say a bit more about that, was about and it was an initial draft of the book, and it was about what he narrates as his first memory. And his first memory, or so he claims, I shouldn't have said that. He'd get upset if he heard me say, or so he claims. His first memory, let's leave it at that, is of the racial pogroms in Durban in January 1949. And he says, as he narrates it, that he remembers very vividly what happened over the course of those few days in January 1949. That was a period of tremendous violence and resulted in half of the Indian population in Durban being rendered homeless. Most of those people were not in the neighborhood where Omar grew up, in central Durban. Most of those people were in Cato Manor. But it still was a really striking event. And when I was thinking about it, I was reasoning that he was 3.5 years old. And the scholarship on memory would suggest that the chances that he would remember it as vividly as he narrated it were probably very slim, and I wrote it that way. And he, to use one of Omar's favorite words, and I hopefully won't shock any of the children in the audience, he fucking hated it because it wasn't his experience. And he got very angry and said that I had to leave and never come back, which was a very stressful moment because, one, I was in Cape Town, and it was very far from New York where I normally live. So I was like, ugh, this is a long way to come for this fight on our first day here. But also because that by this point, this project had been something I'd been working on since 2018. And in fact, it had provided for me a real anchor during COVID, a way to like think about what we were all going through and think about how individual lives mark historical time. And I really didn't want to lose it. And so I had to figure out how to navigate that relationship and come back in. And thankfully I did. And we got through it. But I do think that example is, to me, one of the great pleasures of doing this project. And I do think it is ultimately a pleasure and if not a privilege, is that he is a historian. He is someone who's very, very aware of narrative. He's someone who has always thought about narrative, even within a photograph, which would suggest just an instance. But to him, it is a narrative. It's a narrative moment. And I'm someone who thinks a lot about narrative in writing. And two people who think about narrative are maybe not necessarily going to agree about what the story is. And so working that out over the course of many months, over many Zoom conversations and long walks around Cape Town, and sharing drafts with him, which he then would write back and say, how could you get everything wrong? You are, in his estimation, a shit historian, as he said of me many, many times.
It's very mild of you.
Yeah. I'm like, oh yes, I'll take it. But the end result is something that I think is, it is my book. It's a book that all the mistakes are mine. And I'm sure there are many. He thinks there are more than there are, but there are many I'm sure that we agree on. But it is also a product of this collaboration that was something I had never wanted to do, nor had I really wanted to write a biography. I always kind of thought biography was the lowest form of history. No offense to the biographers in the room. But
Relation to the lowest form of history.
Okay, it's the second lowest form of history. But I'm grateful for having had the experience.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I was just thinking, as a book. It is a book written by a historian, and you do express a skepticism. But how could he remember certain things? Is he misremembering? These questions of memory and history that we all contend with, regardless of whether we are writing biographies or history. But as they say, it's never too late to have a happy childhood, and it's never too late to invent childhood memories either. So, I mean, but we leave that. But one of the things about your book is how sensitively you handle the nature of Omar's personality. And there are these very moving accounts at the beginning of his early childhood, some of the disabilities that he faced, the fact that his mother was almost consistent throughout the period of his childhood. His mother was unwell. His father had a very bad temper. I mean, he was an artist himself. Ibrahim Badsha was an artist himself. And there's this wonderful phrase in your book, between his mother's cries and his father's anger. That's how he grew up. And there's something of that where, I don't know, I mean, I don't want to get into questions of psychohistory, but I think there's a way in which you try and weave that in to explain much of what Omar is. So there are two ways of doing a book launch. One is to assume everybody has read it, and then we carry on an abstruse conversation, or to assume that only the two of us have read it, and then none of you have. So what I'm going to do is to actually take you through the book, right? Or get him to talk about the book. Could you say something about the early chapters, which I've read and I love, but...
Thank you. So this is one of the I think that when I go through the book, my sort of original moment of faith that Omar had this archive that would get me inside things that I wasn't able to get elsewhere, really paid off, because at each moment there was some archival find that was so significant that at various points I actually wondered whether it was all a forgery, because I was like, this is too good of an archival discovery. For example, in the first couple chapters, one of the sources I relied on is that Omar, who he's not a great writer. He was dyslexic and really struggled with writing, struggled with reading. For someone who has become such an accomplished and learned person, took a great deal of effort to get there. But he did for a time, when he was in his more existentialist phase in his teens and early 20s, he kept a diary. And he kept it almost daily in this very hard to decipher, very unique to Omar scrawl. And he wrote in this tiny little Lufthansa date book that he had found somewhere. And I found in the bottom of a box. And it was 4 years of his life. And he didn't write every day, but he wrote very frequently. And it was this remarkable document because it talked about and narrated his experiences early in the art world in Durban in the 60s. He writes very beautifully about when he met Dumile, who becomes one of his major interlocutors and inspirations and great friends. But he also writes a lot about his family and about his experience thinking back on the disillusion of his family, because by this point, his mother no longer lives with them. And it kind of opened up this, you said you don't want to talk about, psychobiography. But I found myself drawn to it in many ways because in trying to understand Omar, on the one hand, he's someone who grew up in relatively, and the important thing is relatively, for Indian Durban, middle-class circumstances. His father was employed. They had better, more successful family members beyond his household. But they also lived, and so his life, he went to the best schools. He eventually matriculated to Orient Institute, which is the best school for Muslims of his status and class in Durban. He didn't graduate because he struggled, as I noted, with reading. But he had a kind of runway that many people in central Durban at that time lacked. But he struggled, and he struggled a great deal. And part of the explanation for that was the phenomenon of his family. So he really admired his father, who was an artist and who wanted to be an artist and had trained as an artist and was an accomplished portraiteur. He could do landscapes, he could do other sorts of paintings, but he wasn't able to be a professional artist. He made his living as a sign writer, working at a local general dealer's where he printed the signs, advertising sales and whatnot. And he was enormously frustrated by this experience. And he had a terrible temper, and that tended to spill over. And Omar was the oldest son, and it oftentimes spilled onto Omar. And then there was this other issue, which I really didn't grasp until I found the complement to the diary, which was all of these graphic drawings that were, again, I hadn't never seen because they were just always under wraps. But when Omar let me open them up, what I found was the serial repetition of a particular scene, which was an obviously Muslim woman carrying a baby. And it was mother and child again and again and again, but without any tenderness, without any intimacy, just this kind of serial repetition of what would be a domestic scene, but something is very, very wrong. Something is very, very off. And then later, Omar's daughter shared with me a thumb drive that she had of Omar's graphic work, and it was hundreds of the exact same thing. Maybe not hundreds, but nearly 100 of the exact same depiction, mothers and the child, again and again. And what I began to realize, and Omar helped me understand and then kind of working through, was this experience of his mother, Miriam, who had married into the Badshas and moved in with the Badshas, and who wasn't from Durban and wasn't of this community. And in the book, I try to get at how dense of a community this was and how vibrant and taxing it was to be a member of this community. And over the course of from 1944 until 1955, she essentially was either pregnant or taking care of an infant for the entire decade, during which time she lost 2 children. And at some point, she seems to have suffered a psychotic episode that Omar and his siblings now diagnosed her as being schizophrenic, but they didn't have the language for that at the time. But in his diary, he narrates these memories of both her nervous collapse and also just this anger that would explode out of her, and these episodes of just terror, that he then found himself between his father and his mother. And it was a really fascinating is probably not the right word. It's a little bit, it doesn't give the emotional tenor of it. But to sit there, and we would have these moments when Omar would come in and see me reading his diaries, and he'd look over my shoulder and I'd be reading a very vivid description by his younger self from 1965 or 66 of his father striking him. And he would just kind of stand there. And it could possibly be that even he could not read his own handwriting, so he didn't know what was on there. But assuming that he could, there was just these moments of kind of silence that he's just kind of there, listening, reading over my shoulder, and then he would kind of walk away. And so it was this he gave me this incredible access to these very, very painful moments, which I've come to conclude was a way of, he was inviting me to try to understand who he was and why he was. And so one of the things that I then try to understand in the book is how, without access to therapy, to trying to find a way to deal with these issues, he turned to first art and then eventually really to activism as almost a form of productive disassociation, as a way of saying my personal trauma is nothing compared to the political trauma that is everywhere and that is evident in our society. And so his artistic practice, his political practice became a means of addressing these challenges he felt in his own experience. And there are downsides to that, because one of the downsides is if you are so closely connected and so intimately connected to your organization, and it is what gives you meaning in the absence of your really addressing your own personal issues. If someone says, I don't like the way we're taking this organization, you're going to take that very, very personally, in a way that many people didn't, I don't think, really grasp why it was that he was so invested to a point of, oftentimes to a point of anger in things.
That he felt the need to stand his ground in the most inapposite circumstances, and actually your book helped me understand much of what Omar is like as a person, where the roots of his anger and obstinacy come from. So, while as a historian I'm skeptical about psychobiography, I think you've done it so beautifully that it allows us to have a sense of empathy for this person, right? But the other thing that I want to move on to is that you talk about his early years in art, his desire for a non-racialized art, the fact that art was an inheritance. His father, Ibrahim, was a wonderful painter and artist. And when I first moved to South Africa in 2010, the first exhibition that I organized was the artwork of Omar and Ibrahim Badsha under the Umdoni tree, which traveled to Durban and elsewhere. I have a review which is not cited in the footnotes, but I'll let that pass. So had to get that in. So there's a lot about the fact that his father tries to draw him towards a certain kind of Islamic art. He wants to move away from that, to have the art in many senses disembedded from some notion of identity. But what I want to ask you now is more a question of what it was to be an artist in apartheid South Africa. And this is a question I think you deal with, but not in great detail. And so that's something that I want to ask you about, because, so for example, his deep friendship with Dumile Feni, which lasts all the way until Dumile Feni is dead. Dumile leaves, goes to New York. They finally meet up in New York after Omar has been denied a passport again and again and again because of his trade union activities. And I remember a story that Omar told me about Dumile and he used to sketch together. And there's at one point, Dumile comes in panic to his father, Ibrahim, and says, look, I've entered this art competition and I have to paint a white person. Now, what do you mix to get the color white? Right? Because he was used to painting black bodies and to sketching black bodies. And so there's something about the artist under apartheid and the problems of actually visualizing a world that you could not be part of, right? And so where would you get the live models from? And again, Omar was forthcoming but discreet about the Jewish lady who posed in the nude for them. And that's how Dumile and he learned to engage with the form. And so this leads us to the title, the wonderful title of your book, Available Light. And this is a reference to the fact that Omar always shot without a flash. He shot in available light, which is why his very first attempt at photography was a series of black, photographs, which when he tried to record the conditions in a factory, right? So he went inside and he took photographs and he came back home and there was nothing but darkness that he saw. But this is also a metaphor. It's also a metaphor for, I think, for available subjects. What were the subjects available to you as an Indian as an African. So when you think about the entire oeuvre of Omar, you get Indians and Africans, you think about Santu Mofokeng, or you think about Magobani, you're thinking about black subjects, and you think about Goldblatt across the board. White subjects, black subjects, Indian subjects. And this is again something that I've had a lot of conversations with Omar about, that he couldn't photograph the world. He could only photograph these subjects that were available to him. And so this is something that, so when you think about people like Ranjit Kali, for example, my friend Kaleem Rajab brought out a book on his photographs. And so the question that I want to ask is really, when we think about Goldblatt, we think about art and aesthetics. When we think about Omar, we think about photojournalism. And this, I think, is the fatal wound of apartheid. Because anyone who's seen Omar's photographs knows these are brilliant photographs. I mean, in terms of composition, in terms of light, in terms of what he did without the flash and so on. So what would it mean to think about Omar as a photographer under apartheid, which maybe that's the second word, but maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say, and I don't remember if your review was cited, this in the original book was twice as long as this one. And that was not publishable. So there was a lot of things that cut out, though I can't remember.
That's a good
so who knows?
there.
We'll see.
What I have to say is in what I have not written.
I think the best way to answer it, and I hear two questions in there. One is this question of being an artist under apartheid. And then the other is a question about how we then kind of think about the art. And there's the aesthetic question and the limits of how we interpret it, which is different from the practical nature of being an artist under apartheid, the experiential aspect of that. And so I think I would try and answer both. To the more sort of experiential question is one of the challenging things, and I think this was true. Well, first of all, it wasn't that hard to be a white artist under apartheid. I think it's important that there were art schools, there were excellent art schools, there were resources. There was actually a tertiary art education degree that was available for Indians under apartheid that kicked off in the early 1960s that Omar was invited to participate in, even though he had not passed his matric and was not otherwise eligible for going to what was then Salisbury Island, what becomes University of Durban, Westville. But he rejected going to that art program because it was just for Indians. And he had this memory of this program that his father had been in the 1950s, which was an explicitly non-racial art program, despite the fact that it had a very racialist name. It was called the Bantu Indian Colored Artists, or BICA as it was known. But it actually is kind of an interesting story because that organization was a really high-level night school for people like his father who wanted to train as artists. And they had live models, and they had oil paints, and they had canvases. And they had a lot of it with a government grant because the government saw Bantu Indian colored. Okay, great, that's what we want. And then when the inspector comes, the inspector says, wait a second, this is not what you're actually doing, and shuts it down very quickly. But for a couple years in Durban, this was possible. And that was something that I think Omar had held to and then resented when Ibrahim said, no, you must pursue this segregated art training. But Omar always refused. I think part of the challenge also of being an artist was if you wanted to make it as an artist, you were subject not only to the limitations of the education system and the training that was available to you, you were not only subject to the reality of minimal resources. I mean, Jumele drew with charcoals on paper. He drew on the wall. He drew in ballpoint pen on paper. Like there was just simply not, that's what he did because that's what was available to him. But you also had to deal with the fact that the art fields, the art industry in South Africa was dominated by white people. And it was dominated by a small number of white gallerists, whether in Durban, Cape Town, or Joburg, especially in Joburg, who determined what was the work that was marketable. And the work that was marketable was only going to be a particular kind of work. And so when Omar's first foray to Joburg, which is in 1966, he fails because his work is not legible in a way that is going to be marketable by the people who run these galleries. Dumile, interestingly, who he meets on that first trip, is suddenly marketable because certain people who run galleries in Joburg, especially this one Swiss emigre who ran a gallery in the CBD, saw in the kind of starkness and depictions of of these kind of tortured, broken bodies that Dumile became very known for, a form of political comment that wasn't explicitly or overtly political. It wasn't polemic, but it was responsive, and she thought she could market it. And so Dumile becomes a sensation in part because of that one first solo show, which then spurs these other shows, and ultimately to this moment when Dumile and Omar spend all this time together and become very close later in 66 and until Dumile leaves in 68. Now, there's this other question, though, which is the question of access. What do you have access to? And I think your reading of things with the difference between who Goldblatt could photograph and who Omar could photograph is quite apt. Although we had an earlier conversation where I went back and checked that Omar did in Letter to Farzana. There are 5 photographs of white people. Of friends and so on. Children of friends, but then also there's 2 what would be candid shots of a family hanging out in a park, and then of a black domestic worker with a white baby, which is its own kind of moment. So I think the other thing that Omar, what's really critical for, that he couldn't access a lot, but what he could access and where he was able to take images as he becomes a photographer beginning in the late 70s and especially in the early 80s, are areas places he knows incredibly intimately. All of these people are people that if he doesn't know the exact person, he understands them in their class profile, their religious profile, their racial profile. He understands so much about their lives because these are his intimates. These are people that he knows, either in an immediate sense or a little bit more removed. And so when he's able to capture them, what he's capturing then is not I parachuted in and I took a picture. It's instead that he understands everything about it. And I kept coming back to when I was trying to understand almost photography, I kept coming back to some of these essays that John Berger wrote about Paul Strand, and one of Berger's claims about Paul Strand is that the moment of exposure is not a moment, it's a lifetime, that these are historical objects. Not in the sense that they belong to history, but in the sense that they are narrative. And that is something I think that Omar was really able to achieve. That was his genius. That was his talent, and it was something that he needed to kind of get away from obsessively documenting his own family and his own self, and kind of open himself up in the way that he was able to his community. So in that sense, I can't separate the aesthetic from the social. Because what makes the aesthetic sing, as it were, is how it was embedded within a set of social experiences. Yeah,
but I suppose it's sweet are the uses of adversity. I mean, so denial produces its own aesthetic, and which is why we get no longer the finest films coming out of Eastern Europe with the end of repression. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's the way we need to go, but the most fabulous, in terms of fabulist films, now come from Iran, right? Where there is again a degree of censorship control, who can do what, who can say what, and what indeed can be said. So I think there's a whole set of issues there. So the next question that I wanted to ask you was actually something that arises out of this, because just as you're an accidental biographer, I mean, Omar is in many senses an accidental photographer. It's when he begins his trade union activity, and then there are people telling him, look, you need to report on the conditions in these factories. We are putting our hands into chemicals, our skin has been bleached, there are no toilets, there are no spaces for us to sit around, there is darkness. You're working with the prospect of losing a limb because you can't see what you're doing. And so Omar is drawn into photography. And as I said, his first attempt at photography, of course, has failed. But for me, the interesting thing here is that this is a struggle that we had about history writing in India, right? That everything had to be written in terms of the freedom movement and whether you participated in it or not. And if you didn't, then you were cut off, as it were. And here, the struggle history, as it were, conditions. It's a bit like Spike Milligan's Adolf Hitler, my part in his downfall. I mean, I think there is a way in which one has to think about one's role in the downfall of apartheid. And this is both something that allows us to tell, as you do wonderfully, the story of the trade union organization, which I'd like you to speak a bit about. But I think this is also a bit of a trap, that you have to read lives in terms of the fact that they were proved worthy through the struggle, right? And so while one might say we celebrate all ordinary lives, not every life gets to be written about.
Yeah, I mean, I would say go even bigger than that. One of the reasons I didn't want to write biography is because when I was cutting my teeth as a historian, when I first kind of realized it was something I wanted to do, one of the concepts I was most fascinated by was this notion of teleology. This idea that since we, living in the present, know the end, it is always going to determine or somehow shape our interpretation of past events. And so the struggle against teleology is something that really guides my disciplinary approach. But the problem with biography is that by definition, it's teleological, because you've identified this is someone whose life is significant, enough so that I'm going to go back and try to figure out why their life was so significant. And so one of the things, and Omar, with all due respect, is someone who is very convinced that his life is quite significant. And so having that kind of methodological dance with him was one that I had to do. To the question of, and I want to come to the question of the struggle. But one of the things that was really striking, I think, in the trade union moment was there's a way in which, so Omar is involved. He becomes in 1970, he connects with Rick Turner. In 1971, he begins to be part of these conversations happening in Durban around the Wages Committee, what ultimately results in the formation of these new unions for organizing black workers in various industries around Durban. And by 1974, he's the general secretary of the Chemical Workers Union, which is a brand new union and part of this small cohort of small unions in Durban that, in hindsight, according to our teleological narratives of South Africa, becomes FOSATU and then becomes COSATU and becomes the germ of the labor movement. And he's there at this founding moment. But what was so striking about it, and here again there was the archival finds, was that in Omar's boxes he has his diaries that he was keeping of what he did every day as a union organizer. And it's amazing how disempowered they are, how little authority they have, how much they are failing again and again and again. They have no legal right to exist, so they can't get access oftentimes to the factories. The workers are being bussed from factory to township. They can't actually interact with the workers because they are from their homes to the hostels back to the factory. They are entirely inaccessible. And so you have this small number of people who are basically running around Durban and also around Pietermaritzburg trying to access workers, to try to convince them that they ought to join this union that will give them some tangible benefits. Basically funeral benefits is what they're really going after there. And seeing him as this young person who's doing this task that is really, it is Sisyphean. It is, they are rolling the ball up the hill and then something will happen and it will go right back down again and again and again. But this is what it was. This was what activism was. And what he learned from that, I think, was that it was about work. It was this consistent effort, which is why when I was thinking about the title of the book, I didn't want it to be about apartheid. Right? It's because it's not about that. It's about the struggle to change. It's just about that this is this ongoing effort. It's the continuing present, and it's not ever going to be resolved. And so the struggle itself, of course, is infected with this massive teleology that insists that it was going somewhere. And there were times when I think Omar thought it was going somewhere, but more often it was just the work. It was just this regular work that needed to be done and that he found meaning in and that it could be made meaningful. The notable thing about his trajectory is then he by the mid-'80s, is a relatively known national figure who is able to become the head of this new Center for Documentary Photography at the University of Cape Town at a moment when UCT is changing and kind of coming out of its white supremacist mode into whatever mode it's in now. And he, sorry, I won't say that when I'm actually there. That's too.
I'm at Wit, so you can say anything.
Yeah, I could say it. So anyway, I lost myself with my joke. Oh, right. But he gets to this point where he is a person of influence, thinking about what is going to come on the other side of democracy, what is going to come on the other side of the struggle, or this particular struggle. And one of the most fascinating parts of the project for me was figuring out, because he didn't like to talk about it, how that fell apart, and how it was that over the course of the first years of the 1990s, he had ascended to a certain point, but could go no higher because of how things played
That's
out.
something that we're coming up to 40 minutes now, and I think we should round up. I mean, we reached the limits of human tolerance here for listening. And it's interesting that one of the stray remarks you make is about somebody's in conversation with you saying, Omar, he was a middle-level functionary.
Yeah.
And I think that is the trap of writing struggle histories, where you measure people against that scale, but obviously your book does much, much more than that. And you have, in some sense, to use a famous phrase from elsewhere, rescued him from the condescension of posterity, right? In many senses. My final question, I mean, I just want to read out, your description. I mean, his prose is brilliant. So I just want to read out a description for you of how, a sentence which actually captures what Omar's work is about. And Dan writes, his rules for photography were simple. No starving children, no prone bodies, only people erect, eyes forward. And this is something that in many senses causes the crisis of the 90s. Right, where post-1990s, the idea that photography needs to be political, that there needs to be a cultural politics, is something that is slowly beginning to be eroded. So you have, and you cite Albie Sachs's wonderful tongue-in-cheek observation in 1991, where he says that artists should ban themselves from saying that culture is a weapon of struggle for at least 5 years from now on. So the need to move on. And this is something that causes a crisis for Omar, both in his personal life, his artistic life, as well as his political life. And so I think you capture that very well. And I think invariably and ineluctably, our narratives take us to the 1990s. You begin with idealism and you end with disillusionment. And that seems to be the larger narrative of nationalisms everywhere, right? And whether you're talking about Africa, India, wherever. But there's something particular you capture of an artist's predicament in the 90s. So perhaps you'd like to speak to us about that, and then we can throw it open to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for that. And this is what I was getting at earlier. This is this moment when Omar, over the course of the first years of the 1990s, becomes either the head of or one of the heads of a dizzying number of very long acronymed organizations that are supposed to be like the Federation of South African Cultural Organizations, or there's so many, they're very long, there's a lot of acronyms. And what these things are trying to do is to organize creators who had been, as he understood it, as many people recognize, instrumental in maintaining a aesthetic approach to South African life, and also contributed in many ways to the struggle over the course of that decade of the 80s. Trying to say that there needs to be a role for creators after apartheid. And he puts together with a group of collaborators this incredible document, which is this basically a Bill of Rights for creators, which is envisioning a post-revolutionary society, or really just a post-apartheid society, where creative people will get funded by the state. They will be a trade union. They'll be provided things like healthcare. They will be provided studio space. They will be provided the opportunities to explore, as never before, the extent of their creative investments and create an imagination. And he presents it to the ANC and to Wally Serote, who's the head of ANC Arts and Culture. I forget the Department of Arts and Culture at that time, and they reject it roundly. And I have the minutes of the meeting where Serote basically just rips him apart for having the temerity to present this document and demands that they see the official corporation of his organization and who are its office holders and who are its treasurer and who, because he's essentially saying, you don't represent anyone, you're just some guy giving me this document, why should I listen to you? And it fails. And Omar is gradually edged out of creative affairs, and so is culture in general. And I kind of end that little story with noting that the Department of Art and Culture is actually folded into the Ministry of Science and Technology in the 1994 election. And Omar, who spent much of the 80s kind of at odds with Inkatha, the ultimate insult is that Inkatha becomes in charge of that ministry. And so there's this way in which the story of culture, which Omar thought was so central, is kind of excised from during the negotiations. And there isn't going to be a welfare system for artists. There isn't going to be one big trade union for creators. None of these things come to pass. And what you have instead is the opening up of the existing segregated artist training structure, now open to everyone, but still quite as privileged as it existed before. And one of the things that was kind of tragic in a sense was how I saw that unfold. But it also has this coda, because it's at that point that Omar begins to recognize that one of the most productive ways in which he got people to create was in having people write down or otherwise curate their own personal and familial histories when he'd been running this workshop at the Center for Documentary Photography in the 80s. And so that is kind of the germ of what becomes Saho, which is this idea that even though we can't actually, I should put it this way, that history and remembering this broad constellation of people who created and who participated in these movements, that this is a form of maintaining and continuing that which they had lost during the transition in the 90s.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I mean, it's a absolutely wonderful book, and I read it over the course of 3 days, like I would read a crime thriller. It's written very well, and there are these apposite quotes, and it's just the resonant phrases with which Dan captures in a sentence, like with the photographs, in much of Omar's aesthetic and political practice. Dan's next book is going to be looking at issues of non-racialism, that holy grail that we pursue. And there's a sentence tucked away in the book where on the volume, The Cordoned Heart, which is a collection of his photographs, and then he makes a very perceptive remark. Dan makes a very perceptive remark about the index of the book. And in the index, and the index is like a political document because it says, Asian, see South Africans. Venda, see South Africans. Zulu, see South Africans. Right? And into that heaven of freedom, dear Lord, may our country awake. So thank you so much, Dan, for a wonderful book. And now we're open for questions. So we'll just take rounds of 3 questions, and all polemical, ill-tempered questions are also welcome. He's used to dealing with that. I mean, Omar has trained him well. So, Kate, will you be moderating the questions?
No, I'm just passing around the mic.
Okay.
Thank you. That was very interesting. This is more to you, Dan. As you said, you're a native of, well, New York and America. How did you end up writing so much about South Africa? Because it's seemingly now your 3rd book in that theme. And sorry if that's a very novice, unknown question.
No. I don't think. Should I answer it, or should we take?
Are there any more questions?
So there's like, okay. So there's an answer that I kind of, this is a good example of memory. It's an answer I kind of believe, and then I think there's the answer that might actually be accurate.
At the age of 3.5.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, it's not, I mean, part of it, so I'm not from New York, I'm from Philadelphia. And I went to Quaker school, which is significant only in 2 ways. One, because I think it helped me deal with Omar, because I didn't fight back. And then the other is because that school was a very progressive school. And it was a school where we didn't do things like read The Great Gatsby, which I only recently read. We read like Achebe, and we read, that sort of thing in high school. And so I was kind of, on the one hand, a little bit more open to things, I think, than some people from comparable experiences. And the other part of it is I grew up in the 80s. And in my community in the 80s, the anti-apartheid movement, as it was known in the US, was a very significant cultural phenomenon. And I remember very vividly events that I subsequently narrate in this book, which is, I remember very vividly when de Klerk unbanned the ANC and the PAC. I remember very vividly when Mandela walked out of prison. So these sorts of things were there. I don't know how much I really believe. That's why I ended up doing it. The real answer that I've come to was when I was in college and I was studying American history. I didn't like it. I thought it was, we don't need to go into that. And I found my way into African history and I was enjoying it, but then I found my way into a South African history class where I also enjoyed it, but it was the moment that I learned about Black consciousness, which, having grown up in the aftermath of Black power in the United States and having heard people like my grandfather with his own take on Black power, was something I was like, oh, this is, and that became my senior thesis, that became my dissertation, that became my first book. And it kind of went from there. I keep thinking that I will not write about South Africa anymore. For a number of reasons. But part of it is, to be perfectly honest, I'm increasingly aware of the carbon footprint of coming here. Not only the body impact of a 24-hour transit, but also like it's a lot of carbon. And I don't really believe KLM that they are, that if you pay them $60 and suddenly it's carbon neutral, I don't believe that. Something that I've thought about, and actually a future project is actually about South African creative exiles in the US. Because there isn't that much written, and Dumile spent much of his exile in the US, and it still was not very well understood. And so there's a project where I could just take the subway to the archive, which is an appealing one, but would still be allow me
with
to...
increasing age, travel becomes difficult.
Yeah.
I get that.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, but this question that you raised, I mean, the reason why I am in South Africa, and you mentioned the 80s, I mean, I was studying in England at that point. I was studying in England in the 1980s, and I remember every weekend we would go and sit in front of the South African High Commission in Trafalgar Square protesting along with many others. And so when the chance came to come here, obviously I took it up. Any more questions? Yes, please.
Can I just hand you the button?
It's so odd to speak into a mic.
Hi. I haven't read the book, just in case my questions can be answered by the book. But I think I have 3 questions. The first one was that there were comments around access, right? And what was available. And comments, obviously, in the context of apartheid. But if we look at now, right, there's class, there's, socioeconomic status, and it influences what is available, right? And comments on that in that sense. So that's the first one. The next one was, there was a comment on ordinary. He was just doing his work, But quite often, when we exist in certain circumstances where it's difficult to do ordinary things, the ordinary is extraordinary. And so maybe what does it mean for Omar to just be doing his work and failing in extraordinary circumstances? Comments on that. Last one is, there was the Wally story at the end. I don't know, did Omar speak to what are the comments now on, given that moment that happened with Wally and the intention of it, and where art is in South Africa at the moment, and what the Department of Arts and Culture is at the moment, did he have comments on that, and maybe reflecting on that moment and aiming for something in the lives that artists are living now? And what it means for certain artists in the current context to need access, and those kinds of things.
Great questions, thank you. I will say on the last question, I really do wish Omar was here to answer that, because I don't think I can answer that question. I don't think I can answer how he is feeling about the nature of the art scene now, about the reality of access, about the ways in which class and race and gender continue to determine how people are able to make a living as artists and be artists and what they're able to do. And I think what is true in South Africa, unfortunately, I think South Africa is, and I will make this comment, is fairly normal in terms of what it means to be an artist here. There is no great welfare system and trade union for artists in my country. There is a tendency that you do have money determines a lot of things. I think that's true everywhere. I think South Africa, one of the things that made it somewhat unique during the struggle was there was a broadly shared sense that people needed to both create because it mattered politically, but also create because it denied to be unable to create was in a sense to deny how apartheid sought to define people's humanity. And I think that was, and there were so many, I mean, I think about like the Community Arts Project in Cape Town in the 80s. There were so many projects that were intended to put materials in front of people and offer them the opportunity to say something with those materials. And Omar was at the center of a lot of that stuff, but especially with photography in the 80s. And that does, you see it now and then, but it was a widely shared sense that it mattered. It mattered politically, it mattered personally. That I don't see. You know, there's been moments in my country, but I don't see that. I don't think that's something that we see still. To the question of, okay, your first question was, okay, ordinary. And I want to walk back a bit because I don't think I said that Omar was ordinary. I think the word was mid-level, which also wasn't my word. It was someone else. It was a peer reviewer who I think I know who it was, but who ostensibly an anonymous peer reviewer who basically said, you need to figure out how to approach this person because he was a mid-level cadre, or he wasn't a leader, which is not Omar's experience of it. And he was a leader of AfroPix. He was one of the co-founders of AfroPix. He was the head of this massive effort to organize South African photographers to contribute to the Court and Heart Project, which was the second Carnegie Project on the question of poverty in South Africa in the early 1980s. He was someone who produced work that found its way to the first time I ever encountered Omar's work was a book I bought in a used bookstore in Chicago in 1998. He was significant in that sense. But I think what I've tried to get at, and maybe we can lean into ordinary, even though that wasn't my word, is once someone is determined to participate, then the nature of their participation is not preordained, right? But that consistent effort to participate is what I see as and what I describe as work, what I describe as the kind of labor of activism, of art, whatever it was that he was doing. And one of the things that I find so remarkable about this project is that because of his diary and because of his obvious, like this visual archive he leaves and the paper archive, including the diary, I can get access to that work in a way that I assume, and I know from reading other people's work, there are thousands of other similar stories. And I know that Chakana has recently published some similar stories on this, of the sort of people who are not celebrated, but whose consistent effort was actually what made the struggle a thing that happened and was maintained over the course of decades. And it's something that I have found, not to get too romantic about it, but maybe it's the time for that. I have found that very personally helpful because as we consider the reality of the politics that my country is embarked on and numerous other countries, the thought that there are people who just do this work and are committed to it and that it isn't, you're kind of not sure where it's going to go, but people still do it, is a very valuable lesson, I think. I totally forgot what your first question was. Oh no. So the one thing about access, and if you're interested in it, and I hate to plug my own stuff, but I'm going to do it because why not? My second book is about an art school that the apartheid government ran for the training of black art teachers from the 1950s to the 1980s. And it's basically an extended meditation on that question of, as the founder of the school put it, how do you make, or the principal, I should say, how do you make something from nothing? And this effort to create to help students, young people, think about how they can create despite not having access to resources. It has extensive narratives about how people made clay. So they had something to sculpt, which is very different, I think, than how people at Michaelis got access to clay. And so trying to understand that is what that project was about.
It's
Another candidate
Hello. Dan, I'm intrigued by like the collective politics of some of the organizations that Omar was part of, like AfroPix and the unions and so on. And I wondered if what you can tell us about the challenges and possibilities of some of those collective projects. I'm also aware that I'm excited to read this because my uncle is Paul Weinberg, is also a photographer. So, Omar and him have been swearing at each other for years. So I'm interested.
I got a little shrapnel from that particular. Yeah. I think that, and not to kind of, you've invited me to talk about your uncle. That would be a way of doing it. These organizations, whether and TUAC, which is the Trade Union Advisory Coordinating Council, and which was the sort of umbrella organization of all of these small trade unions in Durban in the early 1970s, is a non-racial organization, as is AfroPix, as are the organizations that Omar always creates. And they're fascinating things to study because on the one hand, they do represent these very idealistic ventures, and you do see people getting into each other in a way that and my first project was on Black consciousness, which had kind of denied, it had its own forms of non-racial organizing, but it had denied some of the existing ones and what these organizations that TUAC is trying to do, what AfroPix is trying to do, is to not be hierarchical in the inherited categories of South African hierarchies, but also, and to try and recognize that they were at some collective goal that transcended their personal identities. Now, and at times it worked. And it was really remarkable to see these moments when you do see this incredible camaraderie. I read a lot about the book and would be remiss in not talking about the role that Omar's wife Nasima, or now ex-wife Nasima, plays in this book, who is a remarkable individual, deserving of her own biographical study in her own right. But she, who gets maintained this domestic space in the early 80s in their flat in Durban, that was just this incredible place of people coming together and spending time together and eating meals that always she prepared, and just participating in this. And it would occasionally get raided by the police, and there would be, these sorts of things. But it's also really notable to acknowledge that not all, but most of the people with whom Omar's had the biggest conflicts have been white people. And you can see it in these meetings. You can see how hard it is, both for white activists, and this is, you just read meeting minutes sensitively and you find a lot. And you see how hard it is for white activists to completely evacuate their whiteness. And you see how hard it is for people like Omar, who are temperamentally kind of ready to go, not to go, and to maybe misread and to jump at something. And AfroPix becomes the best example of this, because by the end of the 1980s, it is a totally fractured organization. And Omar, who had been one of the founders, and he would say the founder, your uncle would say one of the founders, it would be an interesting conversation. He ends up being kicked out of the organization unanimously in 1988. And it's an incredibly tense situation. And a lot of it had to do with race. A lot of it had to do with people's sense of, if we're going to move into something new, not necessarily realizing how race was still going to structure what that new thing was going to be. And it comes to be this question about aesthetics and ideological commitments that ends up fracturing this organization. And it's all there in the minutes. And the sort of racial politics and how difficult it is to maintain non-racial structures is there to learn from, I guess.
We should probably wind up now. We have just come up to an hour. I don't know, Kate, what is the requirement? Can we go on?
I think we can wind up.
We can wind up. So for those of you who felt that this has covered all bases, it hasn't. You should still buy the book and read it, because I've kind of cherry-picked from the book so as to give you a sense of the trajectory. And thank you for your eloquence, verbally as well as your prose. I mean, your prose was a delight to read over the last 4 days. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Kate, for hosting us. And thank you, Jacana, for continuing to publish these wonderful books, which mainstream publishers will probably balk at because they don't contribute to a larger history of the struggle, perhaps.
Dan, thank you so much. I'm going to ask you to stay here for signing. Please buy the book, everybody. It's up there. And thank you so much for coming.